Shadow the Hedgehog. Yes, we are going there, ladies and gentlemen. After the enjoyable but flawed Sonic Heroes, released by the end of 2003 in Japan and start of 2004 in other regions with mixed to positive reception, Sonic Team wanted to attempt a different take on the franchise. Since Sonic games were and are largely targeted toward younger audiences, director Takashi Iizuka desired to catch the attention of an older audience for once. Logically so, because at the time the industry had largely shifted from cartoony and child-friendly games to mature, edgy and deep games more and more. Series producer Yuji Naka stated in an interview that Shadow the Hedgehog was chosen as the starring character for this new game due to its popularity amongst fans, and the addition of darker story elements, vehicles and weapons would have made it an inappropriate act to label it as a Sonic game and then sell it as such. The concept was seen as ridiculous when people witnessed the first trailers in early 2005, and they had no idea how it was all going to play out. Well, later down the year in the holiday season, Shadow the Hedgehog came out for the Nintendo GameCube, Sony PlayStation 2, and Microsoft Xbox for them to find out. Critically, the game was not exactly panned, but it certainly wasn't liked, with the PS2 version averaging the lowest at 45% on Metacritic, and the GameCube version averaging the highest at 51%. Review scores aren't everything, but with those numbers, Shadow the Hedgehog was viewed as the low point of the entire main Sonic lineup until Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 came along. To this day, however, there are fans who will argue it is in fact inferior to Sonic 2006. If that doesn't speak volumes, then I haven't got a monkey's what does. All I knew was that I played Shadow the Hedgehog back when I was a kid and got every single A rank, so I must have seen something in it. Does the same apply now, 10 years later? Well, I'll do my very best to provide a fair look in this video at Shadow the Hedgehog. Alright, so what kind of game are we dealing with here? Well, in terms of fundamental gameplay, Shadow the Hedgehog is the same as the speed stages in the Sonic Adventure titles and Sonic Heroes as a whole. You're controlling a hedgehog at high speeds through stages with loops and other staple set pieces, collecting rings along the way to protect yourself, destroying foes for points and progression, platforming around stage hazards and pits. I don't think I need to explain in great detail what 3D Sonic games are all about, and Shadow the Hedgehog falls right into the same boat. This is 100% a 3D Sonic game at heart. The only reason Shadow is the protagonist is to introduce additional elements to the game that wouldn't suit Sonic's image or character. That being said, let's start with addressing the Black Hedgehog himself and the game mechanics. Shadow, as you may know, wears jet shoes, and that's reflected in the way he moves. I found his acceleration and top speed pretty tight. Building up momentum doesn't take too long, neither too short, and when I'm given the room to blaze around freely, Shadow's velocity feels pretty satisfying to me. His jump is kind of floaty and carries momentum, but you're given a decent amount of mid-air control to land where you intend to correctly. Precise platforming was very rarely nerve-wracking for me, and when that's the case, I cannot complain. What felt a bit off about Shadow though is how he stops at a dime when I let go of the analog stick, even at high speeds. When I do that, I expect my character to gradually and naturally come to a standstill. If I want to abruptly halt myself, pulling back on the analog stick should do that for me, which it does, but as it is, letting go off and pulling back on the analog stick both achieve virtually the same thing. However, the biggest struggle player seems to face with Shadow's handling, me included, is his turning. Many describe it as ice physics, which I don't think is really accurate. From my experience, it's not so much that Shadow slips and slides uncontrollably, but his turning is delayed. Changing your direction will have Shadow fully curving his current arc before he properly heads off into set commanded direction. This comes across as sloppy and icy, tricky because it's difficult to properly dodge obstacles, and it may even have you accidentally falling off the stage. Of course, this was to mimic the feeling of hovering around on jet shoes, so there's a reason behind this. That's not to say I think it was a smart idea. Logic and realism shouldn't have a negative impact on the experience as far as I'm concerned, and it appears many people have serious issues with Shadow's handling. Me personally, once I got a feel for the turning, I honestly rarely had any troubles and thought the controls were just fine. They are a really subjective topic though, and the fact that many people complain about them in the first place is a clear sign that they aren't quite as polished as they should have been. I also still prefer the controls in the Sonic Adventures, but Sonic Heroes definitely gave me more shit. In part, that's due to the controls themselves, but also due to the mechanics generally not being as broken and faulty. I held close to a 4-minute long rant in my Sonic Heroes review because the amount of times I died in ways that were out of my control and instead faults of the game itself was far too high. Shadow the Hedgehog was notably less rough around the edges in that aspect for me. For one thing, the rail grinding is completely smoothed over. Switching lanes is absolutely painless. You have to actively and intentionally jump off now in order to kill yourself, which is a fucking relief, isn't it? The rail switching in Sonic Heroes, hell, even back in Sonic Adventure 2 as well, could lead to some serious frustration and unfair deaths. Next up is the light dash, which is more stable too, since it no longer fails to work at seemingly random, and whenever the use of this technique is mandatory to advance, transparent rings that don't add to your ring count, by the way, will stay in place so you're never screwed over. I'm disappointed to say approaching the trail of rings from certain angles can still cause weird problems though, but that sense of dread whenever the light dash was involved in Sonic Heroes is thankfully no longer strongly present. There are also no awkward pinball physics anywhere to be found, and I haven't encountered a single fatal scripting error in Shadow the Hedgehog. On top of that, the level design isn't nearly as lethal and chock full of bottomless pits, something that further accentuated the issue in Sonic Heroes. Be that as it may, this game isn't free of bullshit moments either. The homing attack is the largest source of them from my point of view. The problem with this maneuver is that it can be hard to judge whether it's going to target onto something. It happened too frequently that I tried to homing attack an enemy repeatedly, but ended up plummeting to my doom instead. A cursor for clarification would have been much appreciated. I also recall an instance where the attack homed me in on an artificial chaos, but for whatever reason decided to just throw me off halfway. Other random oddities include Shadow jumping off from the floor after getting hit with the moving platform underneath him, the rare yet ever so aggravating knockback cases, and getting stuck on a wall with his bird and having no other option than to commit suicide. Anomalies like this can be upsetting and hamper somebody's enjoyability, and ideally, they should never occur in any video game. Whether they do to an intolerable degree in Shadow the Hedgehog is up in the air. It's going to vary heavily depending on your luck, playstyle, and mindset. To me, personally, they didn't get in the way of the fun too much. I could brush them off. It is the same story for the camera. Of its own, it does a pretty commendable job keeping up with the action. It tends to stay behind you no matter what direction you're going in, and because the stages are linear, that's exactly what you need. It usually pans down when necessary so you can land where you intend to, and whenever it doesn't do that, you often already have sort of an idea where the solid ground is below you. It helps that most platforms in the game are fairly large, so you've got some room for error. Occasionally, the fixed angles can be very inconvenient though, giving the player a poor view of what's coming up and where they are going, but as I said, that's only occasionally. It's nothing game-breaking, to me at least. The biggest issue I found with the camera is how incompetent it can become when you've been playing with the manual controls for it. You can zoom in and out with the camera, and it can even be panned around, which is neat in case you want to observe your surroundings a little more or travel travel backwards when you miss something. Unfortunately, this can really mess it up for some reason because it has a tendency to stop responding and flat out not point at where you needed to point at, no matter how hard you try. I don't know why you cannot reset the camera to its automatic mode at will, but man, can this form a nuisance. It makes you feel like you're working with a handicap, and that's irrefutably bad. Even so, in the end, that's the only real gripe I have with the camera, and it only happened at certain intervals, not every minute. The camera isn't perfect, but you'll be hard-pressed to find a 3D platformer that doesn't suffer from camera jank every now and then. Now, as you're probably aware, most 3D Sonic games have some sort of gimmick or special feature that goes along with it. Sonic Heroes has the team stuff, Sonic Colors has wisps, and Sonic and the Black Knight has the talking sword. What does Shadow the Hedgehog have? Weapons and guns for Shadow to use. While the concept of this has caused a lot of controversy, the implementation itself ain't half bad. There is a pretty good variety in what you can play around with. Realistic looking guns and knives are only about half of the whole package, and there are nuances between all the various options. Now, do not expect Mega Man levels of differences, since that wouldn't work here. Mega Man has all the unlocked weapons available to him with a simple button press, but Shadow can only carry a single weapon at a time, so having foes be resistant to or not easily damaged by certain weapons would unnecessarily bog the pace down exponentially. Anyway, both slashers and guns rely on ammunition that can be regained by snatching the same weapon again, and it's balanced out nicely. Crates containing this stuff are common, and defeated enemies drop whatever they held too, but the amount of bullets or hit points you get from a single pickup isn't remarkable. As a result, you'll have to be somewhat considerate with your ammo. Going wild like a madman usually has you reverting to worthless short-range punches and kicks, or more realistically, your good old homing attack. By making the weapons superior to your innate moves, this forces a bit of ammo management on the player, which I like. As for the actual handling of the weapons, most slashers have ample range and are easy to use, but the guns can be a bit finicky. The auto-aiming on them is decent, but sometimes I found myself shooting at different targets than I intended. There is an option to strafe, which can substantially remedy this inconvenience, but for some reason Shadow isn't capable of running while strafing, and the second analog stick also isn't utilized for proper aiming. Sonic Team should have taken more pages from the Ratchet & Clank playbook when it comes to controlling the guns. They clearly took a couple of them, but not all. Overall though, I find the weapons in Shadow the Hedgehog very usable. A different question is how much they add from a gameplay perspective. One could argue their addition is a little superfluous. The enemy AI is all around dumb. There will be times you've obliterated bad guys, or good guys in the case of this game, before they even take any action. There are maybe a few parts in the whole adventure where it can feel like you're caught in a decent gunfight, or that the weapons truly add a layer of depth that otherwise couldn't be achieved, but a few is obviously not a lot. If foes were smarter and more aggressive, forcing the player to actively dodge attacks and aim their bullets on a more regular basis, battle scenarios would have been more engaging, and thus the inclusion of weapons would have been more worthwhile. To put this in perspective, if you were to strip the firearms away from the Ratchet & Clank games, for example, all of a sudden a lot of the appeal is lost because the enemies are programmed, grouped, and placed in such a way that the collection of tools and weapons available to you gain unique purposes and applications. Ones a simple wrench couldn't possibly bring to realization. With Shadow the Hedgehog, it's merely the enemy health bars that make the weapons important, which I think is an arbitrary condition in this case. If the health bars weren't there, a conventional homing attack would dispatch most opponents here just fine in a swiftly manner. The gameplay would remain relatively intact, thus the inclusion of weapons is a bit of a shallow one, at least from my experience. They are more convenience items, and I'm not saying that in a negative fashion per se. Shallow elements don't have to be bad, you know. In fact, the weapons convey a sense of power to the player, so on a psychological level they definitely have value, and who's to say one's experience can only be enhanced through the game's design itself. It's just that, seeing how Shadow the Hedgehog is partially a third-person shooter, I believe there are missed opportunities for more intricate combat. Whether that's a good thing or not for a Sonic game is going to be different for everybody though. A lot of people find fighting robots in Sonic Heroes tiring, and especially in the later stages, I would agree it is. For me, however, that is only because I'm waiting for them to reveal their weak spots, repeatedly spamming the same attacks when they do, and encountering the same faces over and over. I'm not against extended combat sequences in Sonic games, period, because I think they have the potential to expand upon the standard Sonic formula when blended in well. I am, on the other hand, against extended combat sequences in Sonic games when they are boring and only present to pad things out. Actually, I'm against that in any game, so it's also fair to say I'm grateful that the weapons here at least make quick work of obligatory combat sections, which majorly benefits the flow of the stages. Speaking of stages, I'm of the opinion that Shadow the Hedgehog's level design is pretty entertaining. In general, the levels are fast-paced and thrilling as you'd come to expect, with loops, rail grinding, roller coaster rides, and set pieces that give you enough room to go fast. And they also hold some great speedrunning potential. At times, you can pull off specific stunts or come up with alternative solutions to bypass slower sections, whether it's landing onto a small lever to skip a battle section, or performing well-timed spin dashes to reach areas earlier or quicker than intended. Multiple pathways help flashing them out for replayability too, but from what I could tell, not all levels contain them, and sometimes they are so minorly different that it hardly matters to begin with. Still, this could be just me, but on the whole, I don't have this constant nagging feeling that I'm running down linear confined corridors like in Sonic Adventure 2. Lastly, for positives, I think the variety in the various stage gimmicks and challenges is nice. To give you but a few of many examples, Cosmic Fall has sections entirely consisting of loose bits and pieces that twist and turn at different velocities, making for engaging platforming. Digital Circuit has interconnected internet circuits you travel across where you must dodge firewalls. Now that's ingenious. And Space Gadget has these panels that alter gravity, and you gotta figure out the right state to reach the next room. The way the game mashes all the components together is also seamless, so the transitions never feel out of place or jarring. Of course, not all stages are super fancy and original, but reflecting on Shadow the Hedgehog stages compared to the preceding 3D Sonic titles, I have found them to contain a superior level of diversity and challenge, and they are mostly shorter than the ones in Sonic Heroes to boot. I am bummed out that I'm going to have to address a couple of negative points as well. The first of which being that it's pretty easy to run into hazards or enemies. There are a lot more threats to be found in these stages, and even though that makes them more captivating and developed, constantly falling over and getting your momentum killed either because of Shadow's delayed turning or outright crappy enemy placement can certainly feel a bit grating. I think the weapons could have been utilized slightly more in relation with platforming as well. Mad Matrix requires you to use guns to color match panels in order to safely advance, but along with Final Hunt, where you have to suck platforms out of the walls, that's about all that pops up in my head. Not a big concern in my books, but it's just an observation I agreed on after CGS001 pointed it out to me. Cheers, mate. What does really annoy me is how almost all of the moving platforms in this game are needlessly slow. Most of them move at a snail's pace, and sitting around doing nothing is never enjoyable. You could argue you're doing jack shit during scripted portions as well, and you'd be absolutely right, but at least they provide visual excitement. Waiting an eternity for an elevator to come down and then sluggishly transport you upwards does not. The game is also guilty of featuring copy-paste design. One too many times I'll feel as if though I've seen certain locations and level geometry before, and this even extends to levels that you could consider counterparts or second acts. The prime culprit of this is the last way in the final story segment, which appears to be nothing else than a mashup of Black Comet and Final final hunt. It is incredibly lazy and the developers made no efforts to hide it. In some scenarios, the recycling doesn't purely evoke boredom, but also severe confusion. The Doom and Lost Impact are by far and away the worst designed levels in the game because of it. Not only are these places semi-linear and huge in sheer size, but the various hallways and rooms appear freaking identical. They are such a big pain to navigate that I shut the darn game off multiple times trying to complete certain missions. And Central City is another semi-linear example that doesn't fare much better. It looks an awful lot like Westopolis in the first place, and it's bewildering to the point you'll be making progress but become unsure if you actually are, as later parts are virtually indistinguishable from earlier ones. In addition to being perplexing, these 3 levels are very slow paced as a result as well. However, when I look at the whole package of stages, the horrendous ones make up merely a small chunk. Granted, they are an extremely painful small chunk, but the fun and streamlined levels easily have the upper hand if you ask me. Now, notice that I dropped the word missions in there somewhere. Let me explain. The way I have addressed the level design is mostly the way you experience it if you're going straight for the goal ring and nothing else. Shadow the Hedgehog's premise is that you can decide his fate depending on who you align yourself with during the course of the game. You do so by completing set missions. There are times when these are about simply getting to the end of the stage too, but they are few and far between. Instead, the missions typically revolve around killing, activating, or whatevering X amount of objects in the stage, and I'm on the fence about all of this. My largest complaint by far is that you do not get a radar. This makes it easier to overlook something, which is problematic for 2 reasons. 1, the fast pace of the game can be killed. You might want to ensure you don't leave anything behind, but in doing so, you'll be moving at slow speeds. 2, the stages, as I've alluded to before, are mostly point A to point B, not an open playground like in Super Mario 64 and Sunshine. Essentially, when you reach the very end of the level and discover you fell short of the requirements, you'll probably be squandering the whole stage all over again from the beginning. To the game's credit, you can warp between checkpoints, so you don't always have to go through the whole stage all over again, but it should speak for itself that this is only if you have an idea where you may have missed something. Good for you if you do, but you don't get a map, overview, or anything when you're browsing between checkpoints, so this transportation stuff is only really beneficial in specific situations. In conjunction with nightmares like the Doom and Lost Impact, which both contain a mission where you have to rid the place of every last single enemy, I don't think I need to explain at all why you could be in for an absolutely horrifying experience. The lack of a radar and map was a critical oversight on Sonic Team's end. There are lenient missions in some of the stages. Black Comet quickly comes to mind, which has more gun soldiers lurking around than you're asked to kill, but not all missions are like that. While it can be a pleasant surprise when they are, you will not have a clue on that when you're starting the mission, so it still doesn't improve the pacing. Without a doubt, some of these missions can be extremely troublesome and ruin Shadow the Hedgehog altogether for players who want to fully beat the game. Again, it won't for everybody, it didn't for me, but if it does for you, that's very understandable. Is there a silver lining to these missions? Yeah, I would say so. The linearity of many of the stages is a double-edged sword. When you're at the end and come to the realization you missed objects, the linearity is against you. The advantage of the linearity is that it's a lot harder to pass stuff without being aware of it. While it can certainly happen, it's not nearly all the time. In fact, I bet I completed plenty of missions on my first try without backtracking, because with a healthy amount of stages, all the objects of interest are right on your path. It is the most shaky with destroying X amount of enemies, but when it's about activating or finding a few key items, you'd have to be practically blind or oblivious to what the game is telling you you to miss them. There might be 1 or 2 exceptions to the rule, but they're just that, exceptions. Even when the stages sport multiple routes, the placement of a certain type of object is always restricted to one of said routes, so none of them dick around and have you dancing back and forth. Additionally, what route to take is practically always indicated via visual direction as demonstrated in this clip, or advice from your partner on how to proceed.
This interior passageway looks like it's under maximum security. You're probably better off grabbing onto the reel and taking the upper route.
Would the radar and map have been better? Undeniably, yes, but you're not completely left in the dark either. I will admit, it's debatable how much the missions actually change the way you play the stages, seeing how you're pretty much going through the same thing, just performing some extra actions as you go. Having that in the back of my head, I wish more of them were like the chase missions, where you follow and attempt to shoot down airborne vehicles before they escape the level, or the dark mission in Lava Shelter. The former because they change your approach to the stage more substantially, encourage and emphasize speed, which, let's be honest, is ideal for a Sonic game, and justify the existence of weapons, since you cannot possibly take down these vehicles with physical assault. The latter because it not only has the important objects in clear sight, but also because the hazards are changed by activating said objects, which alters the challenge itself and ultimately even ends up forcing you into different sections. It's a shame there are barely any missions designed comparably to these two, because they are very straightforward and keep repetition to a minimum. The last thing to discuss gameplay wise would be the boss battles, and I have very little to comment on. They're not bad fights, but the patterns are pretty standard stuff and they repeat themselves over and over. Not just their attacks, by the way, their dialogue as well.
You know what they say, the more the merrier. You know what they say, the more the merrier.
The balancing between them is definitely off too. Sometimes the fights can drag on for an eternity, while others are over in literally 10 seconds. All in all, very average bosses that aren't offending but neither really worth your time. I shall bring up again though that the ring system seriously ought to have been reworked. It allows for so much sloppy playing. You can be reckless all you want and still survive in the end because you can just keep picking up the same set of rings you drop. Hell, because Shadow the Hedgehog is partially a third-person shooter, I think a reinvented ring system was in order anyway and would have solved some difficulty balancing quirks in the game as a whole. For the 2D games, it makes sense to have this insurance in place because side-scrollers suffer from visibility issues, especially with Sonic's speed. But in 3D, that's not a concern because you can easily see what's up ahead. Leaving older mechanics untouched just because they're so synonymous with the franchise hinders the growth and improvement of newer installments, in my opinion. One more thing about the bosses, I'm also not fond of the fact the game has you taking down the same ones multiple times. There are 10 endings in Shadow the Hedgehog, but only 3 final bosses, and before that you also fight mid-bosses. So depending on the course of your playthrough, you could be running into the same faces more than you'd ever want to. This leads us to Shadow the Hedgehog's progression structure, which is a whole separate topic in and of itself. Not counting the last way, which is part of the final story segment. As I said, there are 22 stages in the game, but you merely have to go through 6 of them to reach an ending. There is one starting stage, Westopolis, and 5 different last stages. Depending on the missions players take on in the various stages of their playthrough, the route they follow and the last stage they end up on is going to vary. The concept seems very promising, giving players choices as to who they want to side with and the ability to change the course of the game. It's good for replay value, and I'll take this over 4 teams in Sonic Heroes that all play nigh identically and go through what is essentially the same adventure. Sadly, the execution leaves something to be desired. The main issue is that there is no option to skip already completed missions in subsequent playthroughs. Let's take a closer look. There are 5 last stages, and Westopolis, which is always your starting destination, only has 3 missions, meaning in order to unlock all 22 stages, you'll have to replay at least 2 missions. That doesn't sound so bad, right? 2 missions? Well, bear in mind that you are still going through Westopolis 5 times, even if the missions aren't the same, and this isn't even the worst part. Even though there are 5 last stages, remember how I pointed out earlier there are 10 endings? That's because each of these last stages have both a hero and dark mission to complete. Seeing how you're always forced to slog through 6 stages every playthrough, that adds up to a grand total of 60 missions, 10 of which are done in Westopolis. And even these 6 stages that come after Westopolis, you'll have to pay multiple visits to them too. Just give me the bloody option to skip missions I've already completed. All the current system does is artificially extend game time in a monotonous fashion. In the game's defense though, nothing is forcing you to check out all 10 endings. It's more like an invitation that is up to the player to accept if they enjoy the game enough. That doesn't excuse the fact some stages aren't accessible altogether without replaying the earlier ones, but that's besides the point. The ultimate kicker comes when you finally do achieve all 10 endings. While you would expect some sort of cool reward to follow for going the extra mile, instead you get a final story segment that reveals all those 10 endings you've worked hard for to be fake ones. That ending where Shadow is going to destroy the damn planet or where he karate chops Eggman's head off? Bullshit. All bullshit. The final story arc is canon to the main series and portrays Shadow as a hero, so the entire concept of hero or villain, you decide, is shot in the balls. Look, my plan is to not pay attention to stories anymore in my reviews because I am thoroughly a gameplay guy. I am not very good at criticizing plots and narratives, hence why I don't enjoy writing about them. I want to remove them from my videos. If you guys think the story bits add real value and are heavily against me removing them, I will reconsider, but for now that's what I'm going to do. Yet, even having said that, I can see how the execution of Shadow the Hedgehog's story is fatally flawed and also significantly devalues the progression structure. At this point, just make it one giant journey to defeat Black Doom, the true bastard of the game, and make all the dark and hero missions optional for 100% completion solely. Funnily enough, the game's expert mode is kinda like that. It's a marathon run of all 23 stages one after another, where you simply have to reach the goal ring and that's it. As the name suggests, the level design is also trickier. While super hard mode in Sonic Heroes wasn't all that hard, expert mode in Shadow the Hedgehog definitely has its moments that really test your anticipation and precision skills. It's disappointing expert mode isn't available immediately after creating a new save file, because I think it would have made the game a lot more tolerable for those who do not want to deal with the missions and repetition of the main story. So, how do you unlock it? By earning all A ranks in the game for the 54 regular stage missions as well as the 17 boss missions. Not exactly a task many players are going to bother with, so your best bet is to download a 100% save file online, assuming you have a method of loading it to begin with. If I have anything to praise, getting all the A ranks in Shadow the Hedgehog wasn't as mind-numbing and draining to me as in Sonic Heroes. The variety of the missions really does play a role in that, and the required score count for an A rank is mercifully nowhere close to as high this time around for most missions. Attempts where I died halfway through the stage or took a long time to finish and still got an A rank were in abundance. With everything gameplay related out of the way, let's discuss the shift in tone real quickly, because it's probably one of the main reasons people hate Shadow the Hedgehog so fiercely. Personally, I'm not offended by it, it doesn't bother me, and frankly, I think the concept had potential. Seeing Shadow riding a motorcycle and whipping out the big guns is so off the wall that it's entertaining to me in a way. It's just that the execution of the game's tone is severely forced, with gun one-shot sound effects when confirming a selection in the menus, random and awkward damn cursing and cutscenes in every damn time you fall into an abyss, and a story that fails to deliver on its damn premise entirely. The other thing to note is that this game is part of a long-running franchise that was known for upbeat, colorful, and cheery titles. There is the argument that this is a Shadow game and not a Sonic game, which can somewhat defend Sonic Team's actions here, but Sonic and company are still in there as sidekicks and the story is canon to the main series. If Sega fully intended to make Shadow the Hedgehog a separate franchise, then I wouldn't have nearly as much of an issue with the idea itself, but by mixing the game into the main series, I think the brand is associated too much with something it should not have been associated with. Because Shadow the Hedgehog has that dark and edgy spirit, the visuals are, unfortunately, overall pretty drab too. Levels like Central City and Final Hunt are utterly bleak, lifeless, and uninteresting. But to be fair, in contrast, there are levels such as Digital Circuit and Circus Park that are bright, vivid, and popping. There are also a great deal of themes that strike the middle ground, from Gun Fortress to Sky Troops, which can look pretty appealing too. In spite of that, the game isn't quite a looker in my eyes, but it's not all ugly either, I'll give it that much. From a technical standpoint, Shadow the Hedgehog on GameCube is pretty much Sonic Heroes on GameCube, same character models, engine, and everything. The texturing is generally good, but there are some low resolution standouts, yuck. And the game performs nicely at 60 frames per second, with only the occasional slowdown when there's a lot going on. The PlayStation 2 version, however, is a disaster when it comes to performance. The frame rate is fucking terrible. Very rarely, when all the planets in the universe align, the engine pumps out 60 frames per second, but all too frequently, it dips far below 30 with input lag as a result. That's not even addressing the nasty pop-up I encountered and the dreadful load times. The Xbox port, from what I've read online, I could tell from looking up footage on YouTube, is pretty much identical to the GameCube version, thankfully. Per usual, I cannot confirm this firsthand as I've never owned this system, but you should be fine with either of these two versions. Just avoid the PS2 port unless you have the tolerance for such a choking game. Graphics out of the way, the soundtrack is Shadow the Hedgehog's strongest aspect presentation-wise. This doesn't really come as a surprise, seeing how this is Sega we're chattering about after all, but it's not exactly Sonic-y. Jun Sunui experimented with darker and heavier music, which, believe it or not, made this his favorite game to work on, and, well, his approach is evident. Typical catchy music isn't very prevalent here, but that's not to say that, in the end, Sunui didn't deliver. His arrangements and compositions suit all the settings and circumstances in the adventure. When a level is edgy, the track is edgy. When a level is trippy, the track is trippy. And when a level represents an impactful part of Shadow's past, the track is impactful. There are songs I cannot say enough about, songs I simply like, songs I do not care for, and songs that irritate me beyond belief. And songs with that generic butt rock sound also present in Sonic Adventure 2 are difficult to identify, but ultimately this is still a quality and underappreciated score. I prefer most other installments in the franchise when it comes to the audio department, but there are tunes here that deserve recognition for sure. From the way I experienced it, Shadow the Hedgehog is not deserving of its awful reputation it has amongst fans nowadays. When I booted up my Wii U to start the game, I was secretly expecting to have a miserable time from the way others have smashed it into a bloody pulp. But reflecting on the 24 hours total I've put into the game, I would be outright lying if I said I didn't enjoy my time with it overall. I surprised myself there, but do note people, I'm not saying the game is great just cause I happen to like it. For a AAA title released in 2005, Shadow the Hedgehog could have been handled and designed significantly better. The story is poorly executed and the tone shift is questionable. The progression structure is very repetitive. Some of the levels/missions can be rage quit worthy when the odds are against you. Something the inclusion of a radar and map could have mitigated a lot. The bosses are meh. The graphics are overall average in my eyes, and the controls and mechanics seem to have caused a lot of frustration amongst other players. On the other hand, the controls and mechanics worked rather well for me. I cleared most of the missions without any troubles. I found the gunplay, while shallow and perhaps left with untapped potential, solid enough and satisfying to blast the hell out of enemies and scenery with. I had a great time with the majority of the stages as they're often fast-paced, varied and challenging, and the music, while not always necessarily memorable, is still good. All in all, Shadow the Hedgehog is a very flawed game, I'm not arguing that, but I personally do not think it is the abysmal one I've been told it is. I see too many redeeming qualities in it. I legitimately believe there is a good amount of fun to be had with the game, even if it's not of the quality standard it should have been. I am well aware that tons of you out there are going to heavily disagree with my final assessment, and you're entirely free to do so. I'm not going to attack you for it. To those of you who haven't played the game before, the best method to discover the truth about your feelings on the game is to play the damn thing for yourself. And that was the first Quickies Don't Cut It review of 2016. I'm so sorry I haven't uploaded anything in so long, but I'd like to think I'm finally back on track and that the next release won't be too long from now. If you haven't been keeping up with my Facebook and or Twitter pages, I suggest you do in order to get updates and such on stuff related to the channel. Well, I hope I didn't waste 40 minutes of your life and that you have a great day, night, or whatever it may be. Till next time.